My name is Hazel Mark. I'm 32. Last Friday, I sat in an air-conditioned lawyer's office in downtown Tampa and watched my family divvy up an empire while I was handed a dusty painting appraised at $40. My sister laughed so hard she had to brace her hands against the mahogany conference table. The sound bounced off the glass walls bright and sharp. She had just been handed the deed to a prime waterfront estate in Ocala. My uncle secured the lucrative investment portfolios. My mother walked away with a six-figure cash payout. And me? I was the punchline. My mother offered a tight, pitying smile that did not reach her eyes. They all looked at me like I was the joke they had been telling for years. The quiet girl who runs a youth community center finally getting put in her place. They thought they had won. They thought Grandpa Theo's will was the final word. But they had no idea about the art investigator from New York who would knock on my door 3 weeks later. And they certainly did not know about the brilliant trap my grandfather built to watch them tear their own lives apart. Welcome to Savage Revenge Stories. Before I tell you the rest of this tale, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. I read every single one, and I love seeing who is tuning in. Now let me take you back to that leather chair in the law firm where my worth was supposedly decided. The room smelled like floor wax and Savannah's expensive orchid perfume. The estate attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. He turned the crisp pages of the will. To my granddaughter Hazel, he read his voice flat and administrative. I leave the coastal storm landscape painting currently hanging in the south hallway. Savannah leaned over her manicured nails, tapping against the fresh deed to the lake house. A $40 piece of junk for the saint of the family, she whispered loud enough for the attorney to hear. You can hang it in your little office, Hazel. It will match the linoleum. Patricia, my mother, smoothed the front of her silk blouse. Do not tease your sister Savannah. It suits her. My fingernails bit into my palms. I kept my face perfectly blank. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. But Uncle Richard did not join the mocking. I glanced across the table. Richard is a man who measures every interaction in profit margins. While Savannah and my mother gloated, Richard kept his eyes fixed on the manila folder holding the probate appraisal. I caught a tight, calculated smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He pressed his thumb hard against his gold cufflink, masking his expression the second I looked his way. Let us just sign the documents and wrap this up, Richard said. His voice was smooth, but hurried. Let the girl go home. She has a long drive back to her rental. I did not know it then, but Richard had personally arranged for that specific appraiser to evaluate the estate. He orchestrated that $40 valuation. He knew exactly what was hiding under the dust on that canvas, and he planned to offer me $100 for it by Tuesday. The lawyer slid the final paperwork across the desk. I picked up the pen. The metal barrel felt heavy in my fingers. I thought about the last time I stood in Grandpa Theo's dim south hallway looking at those dark, heavy brushstrokes. I remembered the smell of his peppermint breath and the old canvas. Watch the dark clouds, Hazel, he told me that day, his voice raspy but steady. That is where the real color hides. I signed my name on the line. I stood up and lifted the heavy wooden frame from the corner of the office where the paralegal had propped it. I did not fight for a piece of the cash. I did not ask for a fraction of the lake house. I just walked out. Savannah was already dialing a renovation contractor before the elevator doors closed. Patricia was checking her reflection in the glass window. Richard watched me carry the painting out, his eyes dark and hungry. The midday Florida heat hit me like a physical blow as I stepped onto the pavement. I laid the painting carefully in the back seat of my beat-up Honda. I closed the door and let them have their premature victory. The trap was set, and the timer was already ticking. The morning after the will reading, the phone on my desk buzzed. I was sitting in my cramped office at the community center, staring at a budget spreadsheet that barely covered the cost of new basketballs. The air conditioner in the window rattled, blowing lukewarm air across my face. I looked down at the glowing screen. Uncle Richard. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. I knew better than to answer too quickly. It gives people like Richard the impression you are waiting on them. Hazel, his voice buzzed through the speaker, smooth and heavy. Savannah is overwhelmed coordinating the contractors for the Ocala property. Your mother is exhausted from the emotional toll of yesterday. That leaves the residential cleanout to you. He did not ask, he dictated. The estate cannot afford to waste capital on a junk removal service, he continued, his tone shifting into that practiced business cadence he used to intimidate people. I need the house emptied by Sunday night. Bag up the trash, donate the clothes, leave the floors swept. I am listing the property on Monday morning, and I want a clean slate. I pressed 2 fingers against my temple. I work 50 hours a week, Richard. I have a grant proposal due on Monday. We all have to make sacrifices for the family, Hazel. He let the silence hang, knowing I would cave. It was my designated role, the reliable one, the quiet one, the janitor of the family. Be out there by tomorrow morning, he said, before the line clicked dead. Saturday arrived with that suffocating Tampa humidity that settles over your skin the moment you step outside. I pulled into Grandpa Theo's driveway at 7 in the morning. The house already looked abandoned. The grass was slightly overgrown. The curtains were drawn tight. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, smelling of old paper and mothballs. I reached for the thermostat, but the digital screen was blank. Richard had already cut the power to the central air to save a few dollars. The Florida heat was trapped inside the walls, pressing down like a heavy woolen blanket. I spent the next 8 hours boxing up the remnants of a man who deserved better than a quick liquidation. I folded his flannel shirts. I packed away his worn-out woodworking tools. Sweat stung my eyes and soaked through my cotton shirt. My back ached from dragging heavy black garbage bags to the curb. I was covered in decades of dust. Around 3 in the afternoon, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. I leaned against a broom handle and looked out the front window. My mother, Patricia, stepped out of a pristine silver Lexus. She wore a crisp white linen dress and oversized sunglasses, looking like she was arriving for a brunch date rather than a house clean-out. She pushed the front door open and immediately waved a manicured hand in front of her face. It is stifling in here, Hazel. How can you breathe in this filth? I leaned the broom against the wall. The power is off, Mom. Richard shut it down. She stepped over a taped cardboard box, her heels clicking sharp against the hardwood. She did not offer me a bottle of water. She did not ask if I needed help lifting the heavy boxes. Instead, her eyes darted around the living room, scanning for anything Richard might have missed. Her gaze locked onto the hallway. Hanging above a small credenza was a heavy, ornate mirror with a gilded vintage frame. Grandpa Teo bought it at an antique market decades ago. Take that down, she ordered, pointing a perfectly polished fingernail at the glass. I want it for my guest bathroom. Wrap it in a blanket and put it in the trunk of my car. I stared at her. My hands were blistered and my shirt was clinging to my back. You drove all the way out here just to take a mirror. She sighed a dramatic breath full of manufactured patience. You are always so defensive, Hazel. I am preserving family history. Besides, Savannah told me you took that gloomy little painting from the hallway. You should be grateful you walked away with anything at all. I walked over to the credenza and gripped the edges of the heavy mirror. It weighed at least 40 pounds. I hoisted it up, feeling the strain in my shoulders. Savannah understands value. Patricia continued, following me out the front door and down the driveway. She has vision. She is already planning to turn that lake house into a high-yield rental property. That is ambition, Hazel. You have always been content with the bare minimum. A low-paying charity job, a tiny apartment. It is no wonder your grandfather only left you a $40 thrift store find. He knew you could not handle real responsibility. I stopped at the bumper of her Lexus. The metal was hot under the afternoon sun. I wanted to drop the mirror right there on the concrete and let it shatter into 1,000 pieces. I wanted to tell her that I spent every Sunday sitting with Tio on his porch, while she and Savannah only visited on holidays when they needed a check. But the words stayed locked in my throat. Arguing with Patricia was like yelling at a brick wall. It only bruised your own knuckles. I carefully slid the mirror into her trunk. She closed the lid with a soft thud. "Wash your hands before you touch your steering wheel." "Hazel," she said, slipping behind the driver's seat, "you look like a coal miner." She drove away, leaving me standing in a cloud of exhaust and gravel dust. I went back inside, grabbed the broom, and finished sweeping the empty rooms. I let them have the house. I let them have the mirror. I let them have the last word. It was dark by the time I finally pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex. My rental was a small one-bedroom unit above a noisy intersection. The paint on the front door was peeling, and the stairs groaned under my boots. I unlocked the door and flipped the light switch. The fluorescent bulb flickered before casting a harsh glow over my second-hand furniture. I walked back down to my car and pulled the storm painting from the back seat. It was heavy, heavier than a standard canvas should be. I carried it upstairs and laid it flat on my small kitchen table. I wet a paper towel and gently wiped the years of grime off the dark wooden frame. As the dust cleared, the colors of the storm seemed to deepen. The dark clouds swirled with hidden blues and rich charcoals. It was a beautiful piece, even if the appraiser said it was worthless. I flipped the frame over to inspect the hanging wire. That was when I noticed it. The back of the painting was not covered with standard brown dust paper or cheap cardboard. It was sealed with a thick, heavy canvas backing, tightly stretched and secured with ancient-looking nails. It felt rigid. I ran my fingertips along the edge of the wood. In the bottom left corner, hidden near the joint, I felt a raised bump. I leaned in closer under the kitchen light. It was a dark red wax stamp. It was faded, brittle, and cracked around the edges. It looked like an old gallery mark or a private collector crest. I traced the waxy ridges with my thumb. It did not look like something you would find on a cheap piece of junk. It felt deliberate. It felt hidden. For a brief second, a spark of curiosity flared in my chest. I thought about prying the canvas backing off to see what was underneath. But my shoulders ached and my eyes were heavy with exhaustion. I convinced myself it was just an old framing technique used to protect the canvas from humidity. I grabbed a hammer and a single nail. I found a blank spot on the wall above my small sofa and drove the nail into the cheap drywall. I hung the painting and stepped back. The dark storm looked striking against the plain white wall. I turned off the kitchen light and went to the bathroom to wash the estate dust off my skin. I went to bed believing the war was over. I thought I had safely surrendered and the family would finally leave me alone. I did not know that across town, Uncle Richard was already sitting in his home office making hushed phone calls. He was trying to track down a discreet private buyer for a very specific mid-century masterpiece. He needed to flip it fast before any official records were updated. He thought he had all the time in the world to trick me into selling it to him. I did not know I was sleeping 10 feet away from a fortune. And I certainly did not know that a sharp-suited man carrying a leather briefcase had just booked a one-way ticket from New York to Tampa with my exact address written on the first page of his notebook. 3 weeks vanished into a blur of endless budget meetings and sticky Florida afternoons. I spent my days mediating arguments between teenagers at the community center and my evenings eating cheap takeout on my faded sofa. The painting hung on the wall above me. A silent, dark companion in an otherwise empty room. I had not heard a single word from my sister or my mother since the will reading. I had not heard from my uncle since I swept the last pile of dust out of Grandpa Theo's house. Silence from my family never meant peace. It usually meant they were reloading. It happened on a Tuesday night. A sharp, authoritative rap against my peeling front door echoed through the small apartment. 3 quick, deliberate strikes. It was not the hesitant tap of a neighbor needing to borrow sugar or the heavy pounding of a delivery driver. My stomach tightened. My first thought went straight to Uncle Richard. I assumed he had found some phantom estate fee and sent a collector to shake me down for the balance. I set my fork down and walked to the door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open, ready for a fight. The man standing in the breezeway did not look like a local debt collector. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of my rundown complex. The fabric was expensive. His shoes were polished leather. He held a slim briefcase in his right hand. His posture was straight, his gaze sharp and analytical. "Ms. Mark," he asked. His voice carried the crisp, clipped cadence of a New Yorker. "I am Elias Thorne." I kept my hand firmly on the doorknob, blocking the entrance. "If Richard sent you about the estate taxes, you can tell him to contact my legal aid office," I said. "I do not have any hidden cash." Elias blinked, slightly taken aback by my hostility. He raised his free hand, palm open, in a gesture of peace. "I am not here on behalf of your uncle, Ms. Mark. I do not collect taxes. I am an art historian and a provenance investigator. I work with global auction houses to track down lost or stolen assets." That sentence hung in the humid air between us. Art historian, lost assets. Before my tired brain could process what he was saying, his eyes shifted past my shoulder. He looked directly into my small living room. The change in his demeanor was instant. The polite professional mask dropped. His jaw went slack. The leather briefcase in his hand dipped slightly, as if he had lost feeling in his fingers. He stared at the wall above my sofa. "We have been looking for this piece for 30 years, he breathed out. The words were barely more than a whisper. "May I?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the canvas. I stepped aside, numbly, letting him into the apartment. He walked slowly across the cheap carpet toward the painting, like a man approaching a wild animal he was afraid to startle. He stopped inches from the frame. He did not touch it. He just studied the heavy brushstrokes and the dark, swirling clouds. "My firm was hired by an international insurance syndicate," Elias said, his voice recovering its professional edge, though I could hear the adrenaline beneath it. "Decades ago, a high-profile modernist collection was supposedly destroyed in a warehouse fire. The insurance was paid out. But rumors circulated that a few pieces survived and vanished into the private market." He turned his head slightly to look at me. 2 weeks ago, an automated algorithm flagged a routine probate inventory in Florida. The appraiser your uncle hired filed a mandatory photograph of a $40 thrift store landscape for the county records. That photograph hit our global database. The algorithm caught a structural match in the composition. I crossed my arms, feeling a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. "That is impossible," I said. "My grandfather was a woodworker. He did not buy black market art. He lived in a modest house in Ocala." Elias pulled a pair of wire-rimmed glasses from his breast pocket and slipped them on. He leaned so close to the canvas his breath ruffled the dust I had missed. "He did not buy it on the black market, Ms. Mark. He likely acquired it legally before the artist reached global fame. Look here." He pointed a long, elegant finger at the bottom left corner of the canvas. It was the exact spot right above the thick wax seal I had noticed 3 weeks ago. I thought it was just a scratch in the dark blue paint, a stray mark where the brush had slipped during a frantic stroke. "That is not a scratch," Elias said, stepping back to let me see. "That is a signature, a very specific, obscured monogram the artist used only during his coastal period in the late 50s. Your grandfather knew exactly what he had. He hid it in plain sight." While I stood in my living room trying to comprehend the impossible, Uncle Richard was pacing the floor of his home office 20 miles away. His phone was pressed tight against his ear. The ice in his scotch glass clinked a frantic, irregular rhythm. "What do you mean the registry got a hit?" Richard snapped into the receiver. He had spent the last 3 weeks negotiating with a shady private broker in Miami, promising to deliver a verified mid-century masterpiece by the end of the month. Richard had orchestrated the fake $40 appraisal specifically to blind the IRS and the rest of the family. The broker on the other end of the line sounded nervous. A New York provenance firm pulled the probate record, Richard. Elias Thorne booked a flight to Tampa this morning. He tracks high-value assets for the major houses. If Thorne is in Florida, the piece is burnt. You cannot sell it quietly anymore. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. His timeline was gone. The quiet window where he could manipulate his grieving niece into selling him a worthless painting for a $100 bill had just slammed shut. He needed that money. He had staggering debts he had kept hidden from Savannah and Patricia for a decade. Debts that were coming due. He slammed his fist down on his mahogany desk, rattling the expensive pen holder. The digital footprint of the probate filing had ruined him. He had to get to my apartment before Elias Thorne exposed the truth. Back in my living room, I felt the walls closing in. The roar of traffic from the intersection outside faded into a dull, distant hum. I looked at the dark storm clouds on the canvas, the painting I had hauled in the back of my Honda, the painting my sister had laughed at in the law firm. "What does this mean, Elias?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. Elias Thorne turned away from the wall and looked at me. His expression was a mixture of awe and deep concern. He walked over to my cheap kitchen table and set his leather briefcase down. The brass locks clicked open with a sharp, heavy sound. "Ms. Mark," he said gently, pulling out a thick file of authentication documents, "you need to sit down, because your life is about to change, and the people you call family are going to do everything in their power to take it from you." I sank into the nearest dining chair. The cheap plastic groaned under my sudden weight. Elias Thorne unclasped his leather briefcase and spread a series of laminated photographs across my scratched tabletop. They were archival images of a gallery exhibit from the late 1950s. "Look at the brushwork here," Elias instructed, pointing a silver pen at a black and white photo of a very familiar stormy landscape. "This is the lost masterpiece of Henrik Voss, a towering figure in the mid-century modern art movement. This specific canvas was long believed to have burned to ashes in a catastrophic Chicago gallery fire in 1982. The insurance conglomerate wrote it off as a total casualty." My chest tightened. The window air conditioning unit hummed in the background, but the small kitchen suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Henrik Voss. The name sounded wealthy and historic. It sounded like something that belonged in a museum, behind bulletproof glass, not hanging above a stained sofa in a Tampa rental apartment. "What is it worth?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow, as if someone else had spoken the words. Elias did not flinch. He did not attempt to build suspense. He delivered the number with the calm precision of a seasoned professional. Conservatively, at auction, $4.5 million. The digits slammed into my brain like a physical blow. $4.5 million. My lungs stopped working. The edges of my vision blurred, turning fuzzy and gray. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned a stark white. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I manage a community youth center. I balance daily budgets where $50 extra means we can buy fresh snacks for the after-school program. I drive a sedan with a cracked windshield and an engine that sputters at red lights. I am not equipped for millions. Wealth of that magnitude felt like a foreign language I had never learned to speak. "I cannot keep this," I blurted out, pushing my chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the linoleum floor. "I need to call Savannah, my sister. She handles high-value real estate. She knows how to manage major investments and capital. She should take it." My hands shook as I reached for my cell phone sitting on the counter. The instinct to shrink was overwhelming. For 32 years, my family had conditioned me to believe I was the bottom tier of our lineage. Savannah was the ambitious one. Patricia was the elegant one. Richard was the financial mastermind. I was just Hazel, the janitor, the afterthought. If I suddenly held a fortune, I would surely ruin it. I was certain of my own incompetence because they had planted that toxic certainty inside me since childhood. Elias reached across the table and placed his hand gently over mine, stopping me from picking up the device. His grip was firm, grounding me in the present moment. "Do not call your sister Hazel," he said, his tone steady and commanding. "Do you truly think your grandfather made a mistake?" I stared at him, my breathing shallow and erratic. "He was an old man," I whispered. "He might not have realized the true scale of what he possessed." "He knew exactly what he possessed," Elias countered softly. He slid a copy of the probate document toward me. He pointed to the highlighted text of the will. "Read the exact phrasing your grandfather used." I looked down at the legal paper. To my granddaughter Hazel, I leave the coastal storm landscape painting. He had added a single handwritten sentence below the formal typed text. To Hazel, who weathers the storm. Your grandfather was not a fool, Elias said. He knew this artwork was a financial hurricane. If he wanted your sister to have it, he would have given it to her. If he wanted your uncle to liquidate it, he would have handed it to him. He chose you. He trusted you to withstand the pressure. I walked slowly back toward the living room wall. I reached out and touched the dark wooden frame. My fingertips brushed against the thick, swirling layers of charcoal and navy blue paint. Watch the dark clouds, Hazel, he had told me. That is where the real color hides. A shiver ran down my spine. Teo was not speaking in polite metaphors about finding silver linings. His advice was literal. He was telling me where to find the obscured signature. He was telling me that my inheritance was hidden beneath a gloomy exterior. He saw my quiet endurance and decided I was the only person strong enough to carry the weight of this massive secret. I dropped my hand from the canvas. The panic in my chest began to recede, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar resolve. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale apartment air. Okay, I said, turning back to the investigator. I will keep it. What happens next? Elias offered a brief, approving nod. We need to secure the provenance immediately, he explained, opening a sleek silver laptop on my dining table. I must register the piece for private authentication through our secure international network. This flags the asset under my firm's protection, preventing any illicit sale on the black market. It proves you are the legal holder before the official appraisal goes public. He began typing rapidly. The screen illuminated his face with a pale blue glow. He assured me the database was highly encrypted and restricted to elite auction houses and certified art historians. It was a necessary protective measure. But even the most sophisticated digital walls have windows. 30 miles away in a pristine glass-walled condominium overlooking the downtown skyline, Savannah was sipping a glass of imported Pinot Noir. She sat on a plush velvet sofa, her long legs crossed, reviewing her tablet. Savannah built her luxury real estate empire by being ruthless and excessively informed. She did not just sell houses, she monitored regional wealth. To stay ahead of competing realtors, Savannah subscribed to a prohibitively expensive asset tracking software. The algorithm scraped elite financial registries, probate filings, and international auction databases. Whenever a high net worth individual relocated or liquidated major assets, her tracker sent her an alert, allowing her to swoop in and pitch her services before anyone else knew the money was in play. The condo was quiet, except for the low hum of the central cooling system. Savannah took another sip of her wine, relishing the feeling of absolute superiority. She had spent her afternoon browsing architectural plans for the Ocala Lake House, mentally spending the future profits. She had not thought about me or my dusty painting once. Suddenly, her tablet chimed a sharp, piercing tone. Savannah set her wine glass down on a marble coaster and picked up the device. A high-priority notification glowed bright red on the screen. The tracking software had intercepted a ping from a global fine art authentication registry. A newly verified asset had just been logged into the system within her geographic radius. She tapped the notification, her manicured fingernail clicking against the glass. The encrypted file unspooled, revealing the preliminary registration details. Asset class, fine art. Artist Henrik Voss, estimated valuation $4.5 million. Savannah raised an eyebrow, impressed by the sheer volume of the number. She swiped down to see the origin point of the registration, hoping to identify the wealthy local owner. The screen refreshed, displaying the provenance linkage. Origin estate, Theodore Mark. Current legal custodian, Hazel Mark. Savannah stopped breathing. The imported wine suddenly turned sour in her stomach. She stared at the illuminated text, her eyes widening in total shock. The algorithm displayed a low-resolution scan of the artwork attached to the file. It was the dark, stormy landscape. The exact same junk canvas she had mocked in the lawyer's office just 3 weeks ago. Her hands began to tremble. The tablet shook, sending a distorted reflection of her face across the screen. $4.5 million. And it belonged to the sister she had relentlessly bullied and discarded. The shock quickly mutated into something dark and volatile. Savannah stood up so fast she knocked her wine glass over. The dark red liquid spilled across the white marble table, dripping onto the expensive rug like fresh blood. She did not care. Her mind was already racing, spinning a web of deceit and entitlement. She was the successful one. She was the golden child. That money belonged in her bank account, not mine. She grabbed her smartphone and dialed a number, her fingers moving with furious speed. The digital trap my grandfather set had just snapped shut, and the predators were waking up. Thursday afternoon smelled like floor wax and stale gymnasium air. I sat at my metal desk sorting through sign-up sheets for the summer basketball league. 2 teenagers were arguing over a deflated ball down the hall. It was loud and chaotic, but it was my sanctuary. I had spent 5 years building this space into a safe haven for kids who did not have anywhere else to go. It was the one place in Tampa where my last name did not matter. The heavy glass entrance doors swung open. The afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the linoleum floor. I looked up, expecting a parent dropping off a permission slip. Instead, I saw the 3 people who had spent my entire life making me feel small. Savannah walked in first. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Patricia followed close behind, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the floor tiles. Uncle Richard brought up the rear, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. They moved as a single unit, a predatory pack invading my territory. My stomach dropped. I stood up, pushing my rolling chair back. The wheels squeaked against the floor. "Hazel," my sweet sister Savannah called out. Her voice dripped with an unnatural honeyed warmth that made my skin crawl. She glided past the front reception desk, ignoring the confused look from a coworker. "What are you doing here, Savannah?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Savannah stopped in front of my desk. She placed a designer handbag on top of my scattered paperwork. "We just wanted to check on you," she said, flashing a bright, practiced smile. "You left the law office so quickly last week. We were worried about you, living all alone in that tiny apartment." Patricia stepped forward, placing a hand over her heart. "It has been such a hard month for all of us, Hazel. We need to stick together. Family is everything." I stared at them. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. Patricia had not called me sweet or talked about family unity since I was 10 years old. This sudden performance was not born out of grief or love. It was born out of a digital alert on a high-end asset tracker. They knew. Savannah reached into her purse. Her polished fingernails pulled out a crisp, rectangular slip of paper. She slid it across my desk, stopping just inches from my keyboard. I looked down. It was a cashier check. The amount read $5,000. "I have been thinking a lot about Grandpa Theo," Savannah said, her tone shifting into a soft, sympathetic pitch. "That ugly old storm painting you took from the hallway. I know it has no real value. The appraiser said it was just thrift store junk. But it holds sentimental meaning for me. I remember him looking at it when we were kids. I want to hang it in the lake house as a tribute to him." She tapped the edge of the check. "I know you are struggling on a nonprofit salary, Hazel. $5,000 is a lot of money for someone in your position. Think of it as a sisterly gift. Hand over the canvas, and you can pay off your car loan." I looked at the check. Then I looked at Savannah. She maintained her bright smile, but something was wrong. Her left hand resting on the edge of my desk was trembling. The fine tremor shook her expensive gold watch. Savannah was a master negotiator who never broke character. But right now, she was terrified. The luxury realtor was desperate for a cash injection. Her lavish lifestyle was a house of cards, and she needed my painting to keep it from collapsing. I placed my index finger on the check and slowly pushed it back across the desk. "No, thank you, Savannah," I said. My voice was quiet but firm. "I think I will keep it." The fake smile shattered. Her lips curled into a tight, pale line. Her eyes darkened, flashing with genuine fury. "You are making a huge mistake, Hazel. You do not understand what you are holding." "I understand exactly what I am holding," I replied, "and I know you do too." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic gasp. The sound echoed into the hallway, drawing the attention of two parents and my center director. Patricia threw her hands up her face, twisting into a mask of pure agony. "How can you be so selfish?" Hazel Patricia cried out, her voice rising in pitch and volume. She turned toward the open door, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear her. "Your grandfather was senile. You manipulated a dying old man into giving you the only valuable thing in that house. You stole from your own family." Heat rushed to my cheeks. My coworkers stopped typing. The kids in the hallway turned around. Patricia was utilizing her favorite weapon, public humiliation. She wanted to break me down in front of the people who respected me. She wanted to turn my safe haven into a theater for her victimhood. "You are a thief," Hazel Patricia sobbed, wiping away imaginary tears. "We took you in, we cared for you, and you robbed us blind." I felt a familiar urge to shrink, to apologize, to run away and hide. That was how I had survived my childhood. But I thought about Elias Thorne sitting at my kitchen table. I thought about the $4.5 million appraisal. I thought about Grandpa Theo trusting me to weather the storm. "I did not steal anything, Mom," I said, projecting my voice so the entire lobby could hear the calm certainty in my tone. The will was clear. "Now please lower your voice, or I will have security escort you out." A heavy hand slammed down on my metal desk. Uncle Richard stepped forward. He pushed Savannah and Patricia aside, using his sheer physical bulk to box me into the corner of my cubicle. He leaned over the desk, invading my personal space. He smelled like expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke. His face was inches from mine, his jaw set like a slab of granite. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl," Richard growled, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are a glorified babysitter. You have no idea how the real world works. You think you struck gold, but you just painted a target on your back." I stared up at him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I refused to break eye contact. "That artwork belongs to the estate," Richard continued, his tone dripping with venom. "You hid its true nature from the probate court. That is fraud, Hazel. I have already spoken to the best litigators in Tampa. If you do not hand that canvas over to me within 24 hours, I will file an injunction. I will freeze your bank accounts. I will drag you through years of litigation until you are drowning in legal fees. I will bankrupt you. I will ruin this little charity you work for. You will have nothing." He tapped a thick finger against my desk to punctuate his threat. 24 hours, Hazel. Bring it to my office, or I take everything." The air in the room was thick with tension. My family stood before me, unified in their greed, willing to destroy my life for a payday. The old Hazel would have crumbled. The old Hazel would have handed over the painting just to stop the yelling. But the old Hazel died the moment I learned the truth. I stood up straight, squaring my shoulders. I reached across the desk and picked up Savannah's $5,000 check. I tore it in half. Then I tore it again, dropping the pieces into my trash can. "My 24 hours starts now," I said, staring directly into Richard's eyes. "Now get out of my building before I call the police for trespassing." Richard narrowed his eyes, a silent promise of destruction passing between us. He straightened his suit jacket. "Let us go," he muttered to Patricia and Savannah. "She will learn the hard way." Savannah grabbed her purse, shooting me a look of pure hatred. Patricia sniffled loudly one last time for the audience before turning on her heel. They marched out of the community center, the glass doors swinging shut behind them. I stood alone in my office, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The silence they left behind was heavy and dangerous. I had drawn a line in the sand and ordered them to cross it. The war was formally declared. But as I watched their cars pull out of the parking lot, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Richard was a man of his word when it came to vengeance. He would not just wait for a judge to sign an injunction. He would look for a faster, dirtier way to get what he wanted. I grabbed my keys and ran out to my car. I needed to get home. I needed to make sure the canvas was safe. I did not realize they had already sent someone ahead to do their dirty work. I merged onto the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. The confrontation at the community center replayed in my mind on a loop. Richard stepping into my personal space. Patricia staging her tearful public performance. Savannah offering that fake sympathetic bride while her hands shook with hidden terror. They were escalating faster than I anticipated. I took the exit and navigated the labyrinth of cracked asphalt leading to my apartment complex. The Florida sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows across the crowded parking lot. I parked my sedan and hurried up the concrete stairs, my breath caught in my throat. My front door stood ajar. The wooden frame around the deadbolt was splintered inward. Shards of painted trim littered the welcome mat. I pushed the door open. My living room was a disaster zone. Sofa cushions were thrown across the cheap carpet. Books were pulled from their shelves and scattered. My small dining table was shoved hard against the kitchen island. They did not just search the place. They intended to send a very clear message. My eyes darted to the space above the sofa. The single metal nail remained jutting out from the drywall. The painting was gone. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm in my ears. I pulled out my phone and dialed the emergency dispatcher. I gave my address, my voice tight but steady. I stepped carefully over a scattered pile of junk mail and waited by the kitchen counter. 10 minutes later, a uniformed Tampa police officer knocked on the open door frame. He walked in, his radio crackling, taking in the disarray. He pulled out a small notepad, clicking his pen. I began explaining the break-in. I told him about the stolen artwork. He asked for the estimated value, and I hesitated before giving him the probate number of $40, knowing the real figure would sound absurd and invite unwanted questions. Before he could write down my statement, heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed on the exterior stairs. Uncle Richard walked through my broken doorway. He wore a crisp golf polo and tailored slacks, looking entirely unbothered by the crime scene surrounding him. Richard has spent 3 decades cultivating strategic friendships in this city. He plays 18 holes every Sunday with judges, city councilmen, and police captains. He spotted the officer name tag and extended a firm, confident hand. Officer Miller Richard said, offering a warm, practiced smile. "I am Richard Mark. I believe you play softball with my brother-in-law over in the West Shore district." The officer lowered his notepad, recognition, softening his rigid professional stance. "Yes, sir, I do." Richard sighed, shaking his head with a display of paternal exhaustion. "I apologize for the trouble, officer. My niece here is going through a difficult time. My father recently passed away, and the estate distribution has been emotional. She took some property that belonged in the probate inventory. We came by to retrieve it. A simple family misunderstanding." I stepped forward, my jaw locked. "They broke down my door," I stated, pointing at the splintered wood. "It is breaking and entering." Richard offered a sad, patronizing look. "I used the spare key you gave me, Hazel. The door stuck, so I had to push hard. The wood is old and rotted. I will send a handyman tomorrow to fix the frame." He turned back to the officer. "No charges are necessary. We are handling this internally." The officer looked at my shattered door frame and then at Richard and his expensive gold watch. In a city dealing with serious crime, a domestic dispute over a $40 thrift store painting was the last thing he wanted to process. The system was designed to protect men like my uncle. The officer closed his notepad and slid his pen into his breast pocket. "It sounds like a civil matter," he said, directing his words to me. "If it is an estate dispute, you need to take it up with the probate judge. Have a good evening, folks." He tipped his hat to Richard and walked out. I stood, frozen. Richard stepped closer. His broad shadow fell over me. He leaned in close, smelling of peppermint mints and smug victory. "I warned you, Hazel," he whispered, his tone dripping with condescension. "You thought you were clever, but you are out of your league. Enjoy your empty wall." Richard turned and walked out, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my home. I listened to his heavy leather shoes tap down the concrete stairs. I waited until I heard his luxury SUV start and pull out of the parking lot. I walked over to the broken door. I pushed it shut and wedged a heavy wooden chair under the handle to secure it for the night. The adrenaline that had been flooding my veins began to recede. I looked at the chaotic mess covering my floor. I looked at the empty nail on the wall. And then I smiled. My family moved fast, but Elias Thorne moved faster. 2 days ago, Elias had arrived at my apartment with a pair of professional art handlers. They wore white cotton gloves and carried a custom-built transit case. We wrapped the Henrik Voss masterpiece, secured it in the padded crate, and loaded it into an armored transport vehicle. It was currently sitting in a subterranean high-security vault downtown, guarded by armed security and motion lasers. Once the real painting was gone, I needed a placeholder. I drove to a local charity shop on Fowler Avenue. I rummaged through a bin of discarded decorations and found a faded print of a stormy beach in a dark wooden frame. I paid $10 for it. I brought it home, dusted it off, and hung it on the empty nail. Richard did not steal a $4.5 million mid-century treasure. He committed a felony to steal a piece of mass-produced cardboard. I laughed, a quiet, dry sound that filled the empty room. I imagined Richard meeting with his shady art broker, unrolling a cheap print that smelled like a damp basement. I pictured the look on his face when he realized he had risked jail time for a thrift store poster. But my amusement shifted as I began cleaning up the scattered items. I knelt down to gather my spilled mail near the sofa. Something hard dug into my knee. I reached under the edge of the sofa cushion and pulled out a sleek silver pen. It was heavy metal, not cheap plastic. I turned it over in my palm under the harsh glow of the living room lamp. Engraved along the barrel, in elegant cursive script, was a name and a phone number. Savannah Mark Luxury Real Estate. Richard claimed he came here alone to retrieve the estate property. But Richard did not drop this pen. My sister was here. Savannah the Golden Child had kicked in my door and ransacked my home alongside him. Or perhaps she had done it behind his back, racing to secure the asset before our uncle could. The realization settled over me like a cold winter draft. The greed was mutating. They were not just fighting me anymore. They were racing each other for the prize. Savannah needed cash to fund her lavish lifestyle, and she thought she had just secured the ultimate payday. When Savannah took that decoy to an appraiser and realized she had been tricked, the fallout would be catastrophic. She was about to make a desperate, unpredictable move that would drag the entire family into a brutal public war. Savannah steered her pristine white SUV across the bridge toward St. Petersburg. The leather steering wheel felt warm under her tight grip. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror. The painting lay securely wrapped in an expensive wool blanket across the back seat. She had secured an urgent meeting with a discreet private art dealer, a man who facilitated high-value transactions without asking tedious questions. Savannah had already mentally spent the millions. She planned to pay off her mounting credit card debt, clear the underwater mortgage on her condo, and buy out a rival real estate firm. The dealer operated out of a minimalist gallery in the Arts District. The space smelled of polished teakwood and espresso. Savannah placed the wrapped canvas on a long steel presentation table. She offered a confident, practiced smile as the dealer carefully pulled back the blanket. He retrieved a jeweler loop from his breast pocket and leaned over the dark, stormy landscape. Savannah waited for the gasp of recognition. She waited for him to marvel at the lost Henrik Voss masterpiece. Instead, the dealer exhaled a short, dry laugh. He stood up straight and pulled the magnifying glass away from his eye. Savannah felt a sharp prickle of irritation. "What is so funny?" she asked, her tone sharp. The dealer shook his head and gestured toward the bottom corner of the canvas. "I am sorry, Savannah, but whoever sold you this pulled a very cheap prank. Look closely at the dark clouds." Savannah leaned over the table. "Those are printer matrix dots," the dealer explained. "This is not oil paint on canvas. It is a commercial reproduction. A poster." Someone glued it to a thick backing to give it weight. You could buy this exact print at a discount furniture store for $10. The blood drained from Savannah's face. The polished teakwood floor seemed to tilt beneath her expensive heels. $10. She stared at the fake signature in the corner. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Hazel had not just beaten her to the apartment. Hazel had anticipated the theft. The quiet, obedient sister had set a trap, and Savannah had walked right into it. Savannah did not thank the dealer. She grabbed the worthless print, shoved it under her arm, and marched out of the gallery. By the time she reached her vehicle, the shock had burned away, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated rage. She threw the fake painting into the trunk. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. Her financial situation was not just precarious, it was critical. She had leveraged her entire lifestyle on the assumption that she was the smartest person in the room. Now the quiet sister she had mocked her entire life was sitting on $4.5 million. Savannah decided right then that if she could not steal the painting quietly, she would take it loudly. She skipped her afternoon client showings and drove straight to a high-rise office building in downtown Tampa. She did not call Uncle Richard. She did not want his advice or his interference. Savannah wanted total control. She hired a civil litigator known for ruthless legal tactics. Sitting in a leather chair across from the attorney, Savannah spun a masterclass of fiction. She painted a tragic picture of our grandfather. She claimed Teo was suffering from severe cognitive decline during his final months. She told the lawyer that I had isolated him from the family, controlled his medication, and manipulated him into signing over his most valuable asset. She accused me of elder abuse and systemic probate fraud. The litigator drafted an emergency injunction before the sun went down. The legal filing demanded an immediate freeze on the asset and petitioned the court to seize the painting for the estate. Savannah signed the sworn affidavit without a single shred of hesitation. She wanted me ruined, and she did not care how many lies it took to build the gallows. The court system moves fast when wealthy people push the right buttons. The filing hit the public registry the next morning. Local legal blogs picked up the petition. The scandal was officially public. Miles away, Uncle Richard was sitting at the mahogany bar of his exclusive golf club. He was sipping a bourbon and discussing local zoning permits with the city councilman. His cell phone vibrated against the polished wood counter. The caller screen showed his personal estate attorney. Richard excused himself, offering a charming smile to the councilman, and walked out to the shaded veranda. He answered the phone expecting an update on his own quiet efforts to locate the real canvas. Instead, his attorney delivered the news of Savannah's lawsuit. Richard froze. The ice in his bourbon glass stopped clinking. The lush green golf course stretching out before him suddenly looked entirely foreign. She filed an injunction alleging probate fraud. Richard asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper, "Are you certain?" The attorney confirmed the details. Savannah had demanded a full investigation into the estate assets to prove I was hiding wealth. Richard felt his chest tighten. A cold, suffocating panic gripped his throat. Savannah thought she was merely attacking me. She had no idea how the legal machinery actually worked. If a judge opened an investigation into probate fraud, they would not just look at one painting. They would order a mandatory forensic audit of the entire estate ledger. They would scrutinize every bank account, every transfer, and every tax filing tied to Grandpa Theo. Richard had been bleeding those accounts dry for 10 years. He had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his own failing investments and doctored the ledgers to hide the theft. A forensic audit would expose every forged signature and phantom expense. Savannah's reckless greed was about to hand a prosecutor the exact paperwork needed to send Richard to federal prison. Richard hung up on his attorney. He dialed Savannah's number. His thumb pressed the screen with frantic force. It rang 3 times and went straight to voicemail. He dialed again. Again, it went to voicemail. The composed, authoritative patriarch vanished. The man who had boxed me into a cubicle and threatened my livelihood was suddenly sweating through his expensive golf shirt. He waited for the beep and started speaking. Savannah, pick up the phone, he demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. You have no idea what you just did. Drop the lawsuit immediately. You withdraw that petition today, or I swear I will cut you out of every single family trust. Do not speak to your lawyer again until you talk to me. Call me back right now. He ended the call, letting loose a string of desperate curses that made a passing waiter flinch. Savannah sat in her luxury condo watching her phone screen light up with Richard's voicemails. She listened to his frantic demands and smiled. She thought he was just angry that she had taken the initiative. She thought he was jealous of her bold legal strategy. She deleted the voicemails without a second thought. The friendly fire had commenced, and the family was turning their weapons on each other. Later that afternoon, I was standing in the lobby of the youth center, helping a teenager fill out a job application. The glass doors swung open. A man in a plain gray suit walked in, holding a thick manila envelope. He asked for Hazel Mark. I stepped forward. He handed me the envelope, told me I had been served, and walked out. I pulled the thick stack of legal documents from the paper sleeve. The words elder abuse and fraud jumped off the page in bold black ink. My sister had escalated the war into a public arena. She wanted to drag my name through the mud and force me to surrender. I folded the papers and placed them on my desk. I was not scared. I had the truth, and I had Grandpa Theo's hidden trap waiting for its moment in the light. Savannah needed liquid capital. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her luxury condo was severely underwater. The retainer for her aggressive civil litigator had completely drained her savings. But Savannah was a woman accustomed to winning. She operated on the belief that a $4.5 million windfall was guaranteed. The lawsuit was merely a temporary hurdle. She just needed a bridge to get her across the finish line. Traditional banks move slowly. They require extensive underwriting, pristine credit scores, and patience. Savannah had none of those things. So she turned to the gray market. She reached out to a private equity group in Miami known informally as hard money lenders. These lenders did not care about her credit score or her fabricated stories of elder abuse. They only cared about collateral. Savannah met the broker in a sterile, high-rise office that lacked any personal touches. The broker was a man who communicated in terse, calculated sentences. He reviewed the deed to the Ocala Lake House. Savannah had received the property in Grandpa Theo's will, but the probate process was not technically finalized. The title was still muddy. The broker pushed a heavy contract across the glass desk. "We will float you $300,000, the broker stated, his voice devoid of emotion. But the interest rate is 30%, and because the Ocala deed is not fully cleared through probate yet, the terms are immediate default upon any legal challenge to your ownership. If you lose your lawsuit against your sister, we seize the lake house. If you miss a single payment, we seize the lake house." Savannah barely glanced at the fine print. 30% interest was extortion, but she did not care. She believed she was weeks away from cashing a multi-million-dollar check from an international auction house. $300,000 was just pocket change to keep her afloat, while her lawyer crushed me in court. She picked up the expensive fountain pen the broker offered and signed her name on the dotted line. She handed over the deed to our grandfather's house, leveraging her entire future on a single, desperate gamble. Savannah walked out of the office feeling invincible. She immediately transferred $50,000 to her attorney, instructing him to file endless discovery motions to bleed me dry. She then drove to a high-end boutique and purchased a $5,000 designer handbag. She posted a photo of it on her social media feed, her wrist wrapped in a new diamond bracelet. The caption read, "Manifesting Abundance." While Savannah was busy mortgaging her future, I was sitting in a very different kind of office on the other side of Tampa. It was a small, modest law firm nestled between a dry cleaner and a diner. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. The receptionist did not offer me sparkling water. She just pointed me toward a back room where Marcus Vance was waiting. Marcus was a local defense attorney known for taking cases the big downtown firms ignored. He wore a faded gray suit that had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and analytical. He did not mince words. He did not offer false hope. He operated on facts. I sat across from his cluttered wooden desk. I wore a plain white button-down shirt. My cheap, reliable Timex watch ticked quietly against my wrist. I had emptied my modest life savings to pay his retainer. Every dollar I had saved for emergencies was now sitting in his trust account. I was terrified. The legal machine Savannah had unleashed was designed to crush people exactly like me, people who did not have infinite resources to fight back. But as I sat there looking at the thick stack of documents Savannah had filed against me, I felt a profound sense of resolve. I was no longer the quiet girl they could push into a corner. I was fighting back on a formal battlefield. Marcus flipped through the injunction filing. He read Savannah's sworn affidavit detailing her wild accusations of elder abuse and manipulation. He let out a low whistle. "Your sister has a vivid imagination," Marcus said, tossing the file onto his desk. "She is asking the judge for an emergency freeze on the asset. She wants the court to impound the painting until a full trial can determine ownership." "She cannot take it," I said, my voice steady. "It does not belong to her." Marcus leaned back in his creaky leather chair. "Hazel, the problem with family probate battles is the truth often gets buried under expensive paperwork. Savannah has hired a shark. They are going to argue that your grandfather lacked mental capacity. They are going to claim you exerted undue influence." I unclasped the small leather satchel resting on my lap. I reached inside and pulled out the manila envelope Elias Thorne had helped me retrieve from the high-security vault downtown. "They can argue whatever they want," I said, sliding the envelope across the desk. But Grandpa Theo knew exactly what they would do. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He picked up the envelope and unspooled the red string closure. He pulled out a stack of heavy, watermarked documents. I watched his expression change as he read the first page. The skepticism melted away, replaced by deep, professional astonishment. "Where did you get this?" Marcus asked, looking up at me. "Theo hid it inside the frame of the painting," I explained, behind the heavy canvas backing. He sealed it with wax. Elias Thorne found it when he authenticated the piece. Marcus shook his head, reading the document again, just to be sure. "This is an irrevocable, blind trust," he muttered, tracing the notarized signature at the bottom of the page. "Executed 5 years ago." "Theo did not leave me the painting in the will," I said, leaning forward. "He used the will as a decoy. He legally transferred ownership of the artwork into the trust half a decade before he died. The will distributed his remaining cash and the real estate. But the painting was never part of his probate estate. It was already mine." Marcus flipped to the second page. A rare smile broke across his weathered face. "It is airtight, Hazel. He had 3 independent medical evaluations conducted on the day he signed this, proving he was of sound mind. He even attached the doctor affidavits." "He knew my family," I said softly. "He knew they would try to steal it. He built a wall they could not climb." Marcus carefully placed the documents back into the manila envelope. "Your sister just took out a massive loan against a house she barely owns to fund a lawsuit she cannot possibly win. When we show this to the judge, Savannah's entire case will evaporate instantly." A heavy silence settled over the small office. The ticking of my Timex watch suddenly sounded very loud. Savannah thought she was a master strategist. She thought her aggressive legal maneuvers would force me to surrender. She had no idea she was steering her life directly off a financial cliff. But Savannah's impending ruin was only half the story. Because Savannah's lawsuit had already triggered an automatic court review of the estate ledger, the judge handling the injunction had ordered a preliminary audit of Uncle Richard's financial management. The trap Theo had set was about to catch more than one predator. Savannah was about to lose her lake house, but Richard was about to lose his freedom. The courtroom showdown was scheduled for Friday morning, and my family was walking straight into an ambush. Friday morning arrived with heavy, low-hanging clouds that threatened rain over downtown Tampa. I stood on the polished marble steps of the Hillsborough County Courthouse. The building was an imposing structure of limestone and glass designed to make you feel small. For most of my life, I would have shrunk under the weight of it. But today, I adjusted the lapel of my navy blazer, checked my cheap Timex watch, and walked through the metal detectors with my head held high. Marcus Vance was waiting for me near the elevators. He held a scuffed leather briefcase and offered a brief, reassuring nod. We did not need to review our strategy. The paperwork in his briefcase was going to do all the talking. We rode the elevator to the 4th floor in silence. When the metal doors parted, the corridor was already buzzing. My family was waiting outside courtroom 4B. Savannah stood near the drinking fountain, wearing a sharp crimson pantsuit that signaled aggression and victory. She was flanked by her high-priced civil litigator, a man with perfectly coiffed hair and a predatory stance. Patricia was sitting on a wooden bench nearby, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue for the benefit of anyone passing by. Uncle Richard stood apart from them, near the tall windows. He wore a dark gray suit, but the usual authoritative set of his shoulders was missing. He looked haggard. The skin around his eyes was tight, and his jaw worked silently as he watched Savannah. He knew what was coming, even if she did not. Savannah spotted me. She did not offer her fake, sugary smile this time. She glared at me, her eyes tracking my cheap blazer and sensible shoes. She leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer, who let out a quiet, dismissive chuckle. They walked into the courtroom, radiating entitlement. Marcus and I followed. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old wood. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took her seat at the bench. She reviewed the case file, her brow furrowing slightly before she called the court to order. Savannah's attorney sprang up immediately. He practically leaped to the podium, eager to perform. Your Honor, we are here today requesting an emergency injunction to freeze a highly valuable asset currently held by the respondent, Hazel Mark, the lawyer began, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. He spoke with the theatrical cadence of a man who loved the sound of his own voice. He launched into the narrative Savannah had paid him to construct. He painted Grandpa Theo as a confused, vulnerable old man. He characterized me as an opportunistic manipulator who had isolated my grandfather during his final months. When the probate appraiser evaluated the estate, the respondent intentionally misrepresented the nature of a specific piece of artwork, the lawyer continued, his tone dripping with righteous indignation. She allowed the court to believe the item was a worthless $40 thrift store find. We now have reason to believe the artwork is a lost, mid-century masterpiece valued in the millions. She committed probate fraud, Your Honor. She stole from her own family, and we demand the asset be seized and returned to the estate immediately. Savannah sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture rigid, her chin tilted up in triumph. Patricia let out a quiet, calculated sob from the gallery behind her. The judge listened patiently, taking notes. When the lawyer finally finished his dramatic opening, the judge turned her attention to our table. Mr. Vance, the judge said, looking at Marcus over the rim of her glasses, does your client have a response to these allegations of probate fraud? Marcus stood up slowly. He did not rush to the podium. He did not raise his voice. He unlatched his scuffed briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope. We do, Your Honor, Marcus replied, his tone conversational and calm. My client did not commit probate fraud because the asset in question was never part of the probate estate to begin with. Savannah's lawyer scoffed loudly. That is absurd. It was explicitly listed in Theodore Mark's last will and testament. We have the document on file. Marcus walked toward the bench, holding a stack of papers. The physical object was listed in the will. Yes, Marcus agreed, handing the documents to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. But the legal title to the artwork was transferred out of Theodore Mark's name 5 years ago. The courtroom went dead silent. Savannah's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of total confusion. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering frantically. The judge flipped open the file Marcus had provided. Her eyes scanned the first page, her expression shifting from judicial boredom to sharp focus. Your Honor, what you are looking at is an irrevocable blind trust, Marcus explained, pacing slowly in front of our table. Executed and notarized half a decade before Theodore Mark passed away. The trust specifically identifies the Henrik Voss canvas and legally transfers ownership entirely to Hazel Mark. Savannah's lawyer stood up, his face flushed. Objection, Your Honor. The deceased was suffering from severe cognitive decline. That trust is invalid. Please turn to page 4. Your Honor, Marcus countered smoothly, ignoring the opposing counsel, you will find 3 separate independent medical evaluations conducted by board-certified neurologists on the exact day the trust was signed. All 3 attest that Theodore Mark was in perfect mental health, with 0 signs of cognitive decline. Savannah's lawyer opened his mouth to object again, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him. She turned the pages, reading the doctor affidavits. Marcus turned away from the bench and looked directly at Savannah. Theodore Mark knew his family very well, Marcus said, his voice ringing clearly across the quiet room. He knew that if he simply handed his granddaughter a multi-million-dollar asset, her relatives would attempt to seize it. He knew they would claim he was senile. He knew they would accuse her of manipulation. So, he built a legal fortress 5 years in advance. He left the painting in the will as a decoy, purely to see who would reveal their true nature. Savannah gripped the edge of her table. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked at her lawyer, panic setting in, but he was frantically reviewing a digital copy of the trust on his tablet, his predatory confidence entirely shattered. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, protected by a clear plastic sleeve. When the artwork was authenticated last week, a letter was discovered hidden behind the canvas backing, sealed in wax, Marcus said. It was written by Theodore Mark, addressed to my client. He handed the protected letter to the bailiff. I had read that letter a dozen times since Elias Thorne found it. I knew every curve of my grandfather's handwriting. The judge took the letter. She adjusted her glasses and read the words aloud, her voice carrying the heavy weight of the grave into the courtroom. To my Hazel, they will try to take this from you. Let them try. I filed this paperwork specifically to expose them. Weather the storm. The judge lowered the letter. The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at the bottom of the page from my seat. Theo's handwriting on the note was shaky, betraying his age and his fading strength. But right next to his wobbly signature, the official notary seal was stamped perfectly straight, cold, and legally absolute. Savannah's lawyer stood up, but he had nothing left to say. The foundation of his case had just evaporated into thin air. This court does not look kindly upon frivolous injunctions designed to harass the lawful owners of private trusts, the judge said, her voice sharp with reprimand. The petition for an emergency freeze is denied. This injunction is dismissed with prejudice. The gavel hit the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. Savannah sat frozen, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She had just lost. But she had not just lost the painting. She had triggered the default clause on her predatory $300,000 loan. The Ocala Lake House was gone. Before Savannah could even process the magnitude of her financial ruin, the judge looked down at a separate file on her desk. However, the judge continued, her tone shifting into a grave, investigative register. The discovery process initiated by the plaintiff brought several financial discrepancies to this court's attention regarding the broader estate management. In the gallery behind Savannah, Uncle Richard suddenly stood up. His face was slick with sweat. He looked like a man trying to find the nearest exit in a burning building. Given the irregularities found in the preliminary review of Theodore Mark's accounts, the judge announced, I am ordering a mandatory forensic audit of the entire estate ledger, effective immediately. All accounts managed by Richard Mark are hereby frozen, pending a federal investigation. The trap my grandfather built had finally snapped shut. Savannah had pulled the trigger, but she had shot both herself and Uncle Richard in the process. The bailiff moved toward the gallery, and Richard stumbled backward, the realization of his impending prison sentence crashing down on him. Savannah buried her face in her hands, her diamond bracelets clinking uselessly against her forehead. I stood up, smoothed my cheap navy blazer, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving my family in the ashes of the fire they had started. Following the dismissal in courtroom 4B, the situation should have ended. In a rational world, a rejected injunction and a humiliated litigator would signal a swift retreat. But my family did not operate on logic or reason. They operated on pride. Patricia, my mother, had just suffered the ultimate public defeat. Stripped of the multi-million-dollar prize and facing the impending ruin of her favorite daughter, she reached for the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. Patricia built her entire identity on appearances. She curated a flawless image across Tampa society, attending the right charity galas, serving on the right country club committees, and hosting immaculate luncheons. When the legal system failed her, she pivoted to the court of public opinion. The digital assault began on a Sunday evening. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A notification from a local community page appeared on the screen. Then another, then a dozen more in rapid succession. I unlocked the device and opened the application. Patricia had drafted a sprawling, highly calculated post and shared it across every local Tampa society group, neighborhood watch board, and civic organization page she could access. She attached a photograph of Grandpa Theo from his final weeks, looking frail and hollow-eyed in his hospital bed. The text below the image was a masterclass in manipulation. She spun a tragic narrative portraying herself as a grieving daughter fighting for justice. She named me explicitly. She painted me as a cold, calculated predator who had isolated a vulnerable senior citizen, manipulated his medications, and swindled the family out of their rightful heritage. She claimed the judge dismissed the case on a technicality, allowing an elder abuser to walk free. Within hours, the post had hundreds of shares. The comments section devolved into a toxic echo chamber of outrage. Strangers demanded I be investigated. Local gossips tagged my employer. People who had never met Grandpa Theo were suddenly mourning his supposed exploitation. The digital poison did not stay confined to the internet. It bled into my real life by Monday morning. I stopped at the local Publix grocery store to pick up milk and bread before work. The automatic doors slid open, letting in a blast of chilled, conditioned air. I grabbed a cart with a squeaking front wheel and pushed it toward the dairy aisle. Halfway down the aisle, I spotted Mrs. Gable, a woman who had volunteered at the community center for 3 years. She was examining a carton of eggs. I offered a tired but genuine smile and raised my hand to wave. Mrs. Gable looked up. Her eyes darted from my face to my name tag and back again. The polite warmth she usually carried vanished, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. She dropped the eggs into her basket, turned her grocery cart sharply, and hurried down the adjacent aisle without saying a single word. My hand froze in midair. A cold prickle of shame crawled up the back of my neck. It did not stop there. The cashier, a college student who usually chatted with me about his classes, kept his eyes glued to the scanner, avoiding my gaze entirely. A woman behind me in line stepped back, creating a wide, deliberate gap between us. They had seen the posts. The rumors were spreading like a Florida wildfire, feeding on the dry brush of suburban boredom. I carried my groceries to the car, my chest tight with a suffocating pressure. The injustice of it burned in my throat. I had spent years quietly serving this community. I had spent countless Sundays caring for Theo, while Patricia was busy scheduling spa treatments. Now I was the villain in her fabricated tragedy. I drove back to my apartment, locked the door, and dropped the plastic bags on the kitchen island. I pulled out my phone. My thumbs hovered over the glass screen. The urge to fight back was a physical ache. I wanted to log on to every single group and post the truth. I wanted to upload the notarized trust documents, the doctor's affidavits, and the dismissal order. I wanted to type out a blistering defense exposing Patricia for the shallow narcissist she truly was. I wanted to scream into the digital void until someone heard me. I opened a blank document and typed the first sentence. The anger flowed through my fingertips, sharp and desperate. Then I looked up. Taped to the inside of my upper kitchen cabinet, right next to my coffee mugs, was a photocopy of Grandpa Theo's letter. The paper was slightly wrinkled, but the shaky handwriting stood out clear and definitive. They will try to take this from you. Let them try. I filed this paperwork specifically to expose them. Weather the storm. I stared at the faded ink. Theo knew this would happen. He knew Patricia would scream and claw when she was cornered. He knew that engaging with her would only drag me down into the mud where she thrived. Narcissists do not want a resolution. They want an audience. If I responded, I would be giving her exactly what she craved. Validation, attention, a stage. Silence was not a sign of weakness. Silence was an armor she could not pierce. I looked down at my phone screen. I erased the angry paragraph. I closed the application and placed the device face down on the counter. Let her exhaust herself, I whispered to the empty kitchen. Let her burn out. The real test came the next morning at the youth center. I parked my car in the staff lot, taking a deep, stabilizing breath before turning off the ignition. The community center was my sanctuary, but Patricia had deliberately tagged the organization in her slanderous posts. I did not know what to expect when I walked through those double glass doors. I braced myself for cold stares, whispered conversations, or perhaps a meeting request from the board of directors asking for my resignation. I walked into the main lobby. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A group of parents stood near the reception desk filling out registration forms. The chatter dipped slightly as I passed by. I kept my chin level, my eyes focused straight ahead, and walked into my small office. I sat down at my metal desk. The morning felt heavy. I booted up my computer, staring at the blank monitor, feeling the isolation pressing in on all sides. The smear campaign was designed to make me feel entirely alone, and in that quiet moment, it was working. A soft knock broke the silence. I looked up. Sarah, the senior program coordinator, stood in the doorway. Sarah was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had worked in the public sector for 20 years. She did not suffer fools, and she possessed a finely tuned radar for deception. She walked into my office. She did not carry a clipboard or a budget report. She carried a steaming cardboard cup from the local bakery down the street. Sarah walked up to my desk and set the coffee down right next to my keyboard. I looked at the cup and then up at her. "Do not let the noise distract you, Hazel," Sarah said, her voice low and steady. "We have a summer camp to run. The kids need you focused. We all know who you are. The rest is just static." She gave my shoulder a brief, firm squeeze, turned around, and walked back out to the gymnasium. I wrapped my hands around the warm cardboard cup. The heat radiated through my palms, melting away the cold knot of anxiety that had been sitting in my stomach for 3 days. A small, quiet tear slipped down my cheek, but it was not born of sorrow. It was profound relief. Patricia could manipulate the strangers on the internet, but she could not manipulate the people who actually stood beside me in the trenches. True friends did not need a notarized document to know my character. I took a sip of the dark coffee. The bitter taste grounded me. I turned my attention to the summer schedules, leaving Patricia to shout into a void that was rapidly losing interest. Her social media fire was already running out of oxygen. But while Patricia was busy fighting a phantom war on the internet, a very real, very devastating storm was quietly gathering over Uncle Richard. The judge in courtroom 4B had not forgotten her mandate. A team of forensic accountants appointed by the state was currently sitting in a windowless room downtown, pulling 10 years of banking records tied to the Mark estate. They were cross-referencing tax returns, matching withdrawal dates, and tracing the hidden offshore accounts Richard thought he had buried forever. The first doctored ledger had just been flagged by a federal auditor. The silence in my office was peaceful, but the sirens were already warming up across town. The wheels of the justice system turned slowly until they hit a steep incline. Then they accelerate with terrifying force. The mandate issued in Courtroom 4B was not a gentle request for financial transparency. It was a judicial order unleashing a team of state-appointed forensic accountants onto every single ledger Uncle Richard had ever touched. Richard Mark built his reputation on the illusion of impenetrable success. He lived in a gated community in South Tampa, drove a luxury sedan, and tipped golf caddies with $100 bills. He positioned himself as the benevolent patriarch, the shrewd investor, the man who managed Grandpa Theo's assets out of sheer filial duty. But illusions require constant funding. When Richard's real estate ventures began to fail during the market downturn 10 years ago, he did not downsize. He did not sell his sports cars or cancel his country club memberships. Instead, he quietly redirected funds from Theo's accounts to cover his own margin calls. He started small, forging a signature here, padding a management fee there. Over the decade, the theft grew from a trickle to a steady hemorrhage. The state auditors did not need months to uncover the fraud. They needed less than a week. They subpoenaed bank records routed through offshore holding companies. They cross-referenced wire transfers that coincided perfectly with Richard's mortgage payments. They found the doctored tax returns and the phantom LLCs. The paper trail was not just sloppy, it was arrogant. Richard never believed anyone would dare question his authority. The arrest warrant was issued on a Thursday morning. I was sitting in the small break room at the youth center eating a turkey sandwich. The television mounted in the corner was tuned to the local midday news broadcast. I was half listening, focusing on a grant application, when the bright red breaking news graphic flashed across the screen. The camera cut to a live feed outside an upscale office park in downtown Tampa. I stopped chewing. I recognized the brass lettering on the brick wall immediately. It was Richard's financial firm. 2 uniformed police officers and a plainclothes detective emerged from the glass double doors. Walking between them, his hands secured in steel cuffs behind his back, was Uncle Richard. He was wearing his usual immaculate gray suit, but the jacket was bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. His face was pale, his jaw tight with fury and humiliation. The local reporters pressed against the yellow police tape, shouting questions about embezzlement and elder exploitation. Richard kept his eyes fixed firmly on the ground, refusing to look at the cameras. The news anchor provided the voiceover, detailing the charges. Grand theft, wire fraud, forgery. The state alleged that Richard Mark had siphoned over $2 million from his elderly father's estate, spanning a 10-year period. I set my sandwich down on the table. The bread tasted like dry sawdust. I watched the man who had bullied me my entire life, who had boxed me into my cubicle and threatened to bankrupt me, being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. There was no joy in watching his downfall. There was only a profound, chilling silence. The trap Grandpa Theo set had finally closed its steel jaws. Richard had thought he was the smartest predator in the room. He had orchestrated the $40 appraisal to steal the painting from me, never realizing the canvas was just bait. He was caught in a snare entirely of his own making. While Richard was sitting in a county holding cell, waiting for a bail hearing that would never come, Savannah was facing a different kind of executioner. Savannah's life was built on leverage. She leased her car. She financed her designer wardrobe. Her luxury condominium was heavily mortgaged. She operated on the assumption that she would always close the next big deal. But her reputation in the Tampa real estate market had taken a massive hit after her frivolous lawsuit was dismissed. Clients do not want a realtor who is publicly accused of harassing her own sister for a fake inheritance. The real disaster, however, was the $300,000 loan she had secured from the hard money lender. The private equity broker who approved Savannah's loan was not a man who read the society pages. He read the court dockets. The moment the judge in courtroom 4B dismissed the injunction against me, the broker was notified. Savannah's legal claim to the $4.5 million painting evaporated. The collateral she had promised the Ocala Lake House was her only remaining asset of value. The loan agreement Savannah signed contained a strict immediate default clause upon any legal failure. She had 24 hours to repay the $300,000 plus the exorbitant 30% interest. Savannah scrambled. She called every contact in her phone. She begged her wealthy friends for a short-term bridge loan. She tried to secure a second mortgage on her condo. But the news of Richard's arrest was already dominating the local headlines. The Mark family name was suddenly radioactive. Nobody wanted to lend money to a woman whose uncle was facing federal prison for embezzlement. On Friday afternoon, Savannah sat alone in her immaculate living room, her phone battery dead from making desperate calls. A heavy knock echoed through the quiet condo. She did not open the door. She knew who was standing on the other side. The hard money lender did not send a polite collection notice in the mail. They sent a specialized foreclosure attorney and a local sheriff deputy. They slid a thick legal packet under Savannah's door. It was a notice of default and intent to seize. The lender was officially claiming the deed to the Ocala Lake House. Savannah had lost the property before she had even measured the kitchen for renovations. She had traded her only genuine inheritance for a predatory loan to fund a malicious lawsuit against me. She picked up the legal packet, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She sank to the floor, her back pressed against the cold, locked door. The reality of her situation settled over her, crushing the last remnants of her arrogance. She had no money. She had no property. Her career was stalling. She was entirely alone. Patricia, meanwhile, was hiding inside her leased townhouse, the curtains drawn tight against the outside world. Her social media smear campaign had backfired spectacularly. The same community groups that had offered her sympathy were now sharing the news articles about Richard's embezzlement. The local gossips realized they had been manipulated. Patricia was ostracized from her country club, frozen out of her charity boards, and left to sit in the dark, surrounded by the expensive vintage mirrors and antique rugs she had scavenged from Theo's house. In the span of 7 days, my family had completely annihilated themselves. They did not lose because I fought them with aggressive lawyers or vicious retaliation. They lost because I let them fight their own greed. Theo knew that if he simply handed me a fortune, they would unite against me. But by making the inheritance a secret, he turned their entitlement into a weapon they aimed at themselves. Savannah sued to steal the prize, triggering the audit. The audit exposed Richard, resulting in his arrest. The lost lawsuit triggered Savannah's loan default, costing her the lake house. It was a perfectly engineered chain reaction of destruction. I turned off the television in the break room. I threw the rest of my sandwich in the trash can. I walked back to my desk and sat down feeling lighter than I had in 32 years. The war was over. The battlefield was cleared. Now all that remained was the final, quiet preparation for the auction in Miami. Elias Thorne had called me earlier that morning. The global interest in the Henrik Voss masterpiece was escalating beyond his initial projections. The gavel was ready to fall, and my new life was finally waiting on the other side. 6 months can feel like a fleeting moment or a heavy eternity, depending entirely on which side of a locked door you are standing. For me, those 6 months were a quiet, steady exhalation. I did not quit my job at the youth center. I still woke up at 6 every morning, drank cheap coffee from my chipped ceramic mug, and spent my days organizing basketball tournaments and finding funding for after-school tutoring. The millions of dollars waiting for me in the near future did not change the foundation of my life, because my foundation was never built on money. The same could not be said for the rest of my bloodline. I watched the implosion of my family from a safe, clinical distance. The local news cycle was merciless. Uncle Richard was denied bail after prosecutors presented evidence indicating a high flight risk. The man who used to dictate my weekends with sharp, entitled demands was now trading his tailored suits for a county-issued jumpsuit, awaiting a federal trial that promised a lengthy sentence. Savannah's descent was less publicized, but equally devastating. The foreclosure on the Ocala Lake House was swift and brutal. The hard money lender seized the property, stripped it of any lingering value, and auctioned it off to a commercial developer. With her credit destroyed and her reputation in ruins, Savannah was quietly evicted from her luxury condominium downtown. The luxury realtor was now living in a cramped, extended-stay motel on the outskirts of Tampa, working a low-level administrative job under an assumed maiden name to avoid the lingering sting of the Mark family scandal. Then there was Patricia. My mother had always survived by attaching herself to the most successful person in the room. When Richard fell, she tried to pivot to Savannah. When Savannah went bankrupt, Patricia found herself entirely alone. The society friends she had spent decades courting vanished the moment the embezzlement headlines broke. The country club quietly revoked her membership, citing unpaid dues. Stripped of her audience and her funding, Patricia was forced to move into a tiny, leased apartment, selling off her designer handbags just to cover the monthly rent. I knew she would eventually find me. Narcissists do not possess the capacity for self-reflection. They only possess a desperate need for a new host. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The brutal Florida summer had finally broken, leaving a crisp, dry breeze in its wake. I was taking my lunch break at a small municipal park a few blocks from the community center. The park was quiet, filled with massive ancient oak trees draped in gray Spanish moss. I was sitting on a wooden bench eating a salad and reading a paperback novel when I heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel. I looked up. Patricia stood at the edge of the walking path. She looked profoundly diminished. Her signature pristine blonde hair showed a full inch of dark gray roots. She wore a simple cotton blouse, a far cry from the imported silks she usually favored. The heavy gold jewelry she used to flaunt was conspicuously absent. She did not storm toward me with her usual theatrical entitlement. She walked slowly, her shoulders hunched, like a woman carrying a heavy, invisible weight. "Hazel," she said, her voice trembling. I placed my book down on the wooden slats of the bench. I did not stand up. I did not invite her to sit. I just watched her. "It took me 3 weeks to find your new schedule," she continued, taking a tentative step closer. "I tried calling, but my number would not go through." "That was intentional, Mom," I said, my voice flat and even. Patricia swallowed hard. Her eyes darted around the empty park, checking to ensure no one was watching her debase herself. The news about the painting she started, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper. The auction house in Miami formally announced the Henrik Voss piece. They estimate it will break records. Elias Thorne had indeed finalized the provenance and logistics. The press release had gone out the previous Friday, sending shockwaves through the international art community. The secret was officially public. "I am destitute," Hazel Patricia said, a single genuine tear slipping down her cheek. "Richard took everything. Savannah is barely surviving. I am facing eviction at the end of the month. I have nowhere else to go." She finally reached the bench. She stood over me, clasping her hands together in a gesture of profound, desperate submission. "I know we had our differences," Patricia pleaded. "I know I said things in anger. But we are family. You are about to be a multi-millionaire. I just need a small loan. Just enough to secure a quiet place to live. Please, Hazel, I am your mother." I looked at the woman standing before me. For 32 years, this woman had treated me like a disappointing stain on her pristine life. She had stood in the lobby of my workplace and loudly accused me of elder abuse. She had launched a digital smear campaign designed to ruin my reputation. She had cheered when Richard threatened to bankrupt me. The old Hazel, the quiet girl who always sought approval, would have felt a crushing wave of guilt. The old Hazel would have reached into her purse and handed over whatever she could spare, just to buy a fleeting moment of maternal affection. But sitting under the shade of that ancient oak tree, I felt nothing. No anger, no spite, no guilt. The well was completely dry. I picked up my book and stood up. I smoothed the front of my practical navy slacks and looked Patricia directly in the eyes. "You spent my entire life telling me I was worthless," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "You told me I was a failure. You called me a thief in front of my peers. You tried to destroy me because you thought I had nothing you wanted. Now that I have worth, you want to spend it." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, to launch into a practiced defense, but the words died in her throat. She recognized the finality in my tone. The answer is no, Mom. I turned my back on her and started walking down the gravel path. Hazel Patricia cried out, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "You cannot just leave me here. You owe me." I did not break my stride. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I navigated to my contact list, located the single unblocked number associated with her name, and tapped the screen. The quiet rustle of the oak leaves above me was the only sound accompanying the digital click as I permanently blocked her final line of communication. I walked back to the youth center, my steps light and unburdened. The internal war that had raged inside me for 3 decades was finally extinguished. I had established the absolute boundary. The ghost of my family expectations was banished. But the real world was still waiting. Tomorrow morning, Elias Thorne was sending a private car to take me to the airport. The global art market was converging on Miami. Billionaires, collectors, and museum curators were preparing to fight over the dark, stormy canvas that used to hang above my cheap sofa. The quiet chapter of my life was officially over. The hammer was preparing to fall, and the echoes were going to be heard around the world. The black luxury sedan glided smoothly over the causeway, leaving the bright, sunlit waters of Biscayne Bay in the rearview mirror. Miami unfolded outside the tinted windows, a sprawling grid of striking modern architecture and towering palm trees. The heat radiating off the pavement was intense, but inside the climate-controlled cabin, the air was cool and perfectly still. I sat in the plush leather back seat watching the city speed by. The quiet chapter of my life had officially concluded. I was entering a world built on high stakes and unimaginable capital. The vehicle pulled to a seamless halt in front of a monolithic glass and steel building. There were no flashing neon signs or oversized billboards announcing the location. True wealth preferred discretion. This was the premier international auction house, an institution that traded in history, culture, and fortunes. A uniformed attendant opened my door. I stepped out onto the pristine concrete, smoothing the front of my dress. I had not purchased a designer gown for this occasion. I wore a simple, tailored navy blue shift dress and sensible black heels. My only jewelry was the reliable silver watch strapped to my left wrist. I knew I was stepping into a den of billionaires, but I felt no desire to pretend I was one of them. I was Hazel Mark. I managed a youth community center. I was grounded in exactly who I was, and for the first time in my life, that felt like a source of absolute power. Elias Thorne was waiting for me just inside the soaring glass atrium. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit looking entirely in his element. He offered a warm professional smile as I approached. "Welcome to Miami," Hazel Elias said, gesturing toward the grand marble staircase that led to the private viewing galleries. "The preview event is already underway. The major players are all here." I walked beside him, my modest heels clicking faintly against the polished stone floor. The acoustics in the building were designed to absorb noise, creating a hushed, reverent atmosphere. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and old money. As we reached the second floor, the scene opened up into a sprawling gallery, sectioned off by thick velvet ropes and discreet security personnel. The crowd mingling in the gallery looked like they had stepped out of a financial magazine. Women wore bespoke silk blazers and subtle arrays of diamonds. Men stood in tight clusters wearing custom-tailored suits, checking encrypted mobile devices. They traded international currencies and corporate acquisitions before breakfast. Yet here they were, buzzing with palpable anticipation over an item my family had discarded as garbage. A server dressed in a crisp white uniform approached us, carrying a gleaming silver tray. The tray was lined with tall crystal flutes bubbling with a vintage French champagne. Elias reached out and took a glass, nodding his thanks. The server pivoted toward me, offering the tray. I looked at the golden liquid catching the gallery lights. I thought about the sheer magnitude of what was about to happen. A single sip of alcohol might dull the sharp edges of the moment, and I wanted to feel every single second of this victory with pristine clarity. "I will just have sparkling water, please," I said, offering the server a polite smile. "With a twist of lime, if you have it." The server swiftly produced a glass of chilled, effervescent water and handed it to me. I took a sip. The crisp, cold carbonation sharpened my focus. I was ready. "Let us go see him," Elias said, leading the way through the labyrinth of curated displays. We passed towering modern sculptures and vibrant impressionist landscapes. Each piece was illuminated by state-of-the-art halogen spotlights designed to highlight every brushstroke. We turned a final corner and entered a specialized viewing rotunda. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, hanging on a prominent display wall, cordoned off by a thick crimson stanchion, was the Henrik Voss masterpiece. The estate appraiser's dust was gone. The heavy wooden frame had been meticulously cleaned and restored by the auction house conservators. Under the perfect gallery lighting, the dark storm clouds seemed to roll and brew across the canvas. The rich charcoals and deep navy blues held a vibrant, haunting depth I had never fully appreciated in my dim apartment. The hidden monogram in the bottom corner, the signature my grandfather had protected for decades, was now authenticated and proudly documented on the adjacent bronze display plaque. I stood near the velvet rope watching the elite crowd hover around my painting. A man in a sharp linen suit was speaking rapid Italian into a secure phone pacing near the display. A woman with silver hair and a jeweler loop was leaning as close to the canvas as the security guards would allow, examining the texture of the thick oil paint. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, analyzing the composition and the miraculous story of its survival. Elias stepped up beside me and pulled a slim tablet from his breast pocket. He tapped the screen, pulling up a highly secured, encrypted registry. "The global interest is staggering," Hazel Elias murmured, keeping his voice low enough that only I could hear. "We have proxy bidders registered from all over the world. There is a private museum consortium calling in from London. A tech mogul from Tokyo who specifically collects mid-century maritime pieces. A hedge fund manager from Geneva who has already submitted a blind pre-bid that shattered our reserve price." I looked at the digital list of international cities glowing on his tablet screen. London, Tokyo, Geneva, Manhattan. The names represented vast oceans of capital preparing to fight a financial war over this canvas. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water. My mind drifted back to that suffocating Saturday afternoon in Ocala. I remembered the sweat rolling down my spine as I dragged heavy black trash bags to the curb. I remembered Uncle Richard barking orders through the phone, treating me like unpaid labor. I remembered my mother Patricia sneering at me, demanding I carry a heavy vintage mirror to her pristine luxury vehicle, while calling me an unambitious failure. They had relegated me to the role of the estate janitor. They had tossed me a $40 punchline and expected me to fade into the background. Yet here I was, standing in a high-security Miami art gallery, flanked by a premier provenance investigator, watching billionaires across the globe line up to purchase the very item my family had abandoned. The contrast was dizzying, but it did not make me dizzy. It grounded me. I realized in that quiet viewing room that the ultimate revenge was not just exposing Richard's embezzlement or triggering Savannah's financial ruin. The true revenge was standing in this room, holding the keys to an absolute empire and remaining exactly who I always was. I had not compromised my integrity. I had not resorted to their dirty tactics. I had simply weathered the storm, just as Grandpa Theo knew I would. "Do you feel nervous?" Elias asked, breaking into my thoughts. He slid the tablet back into his pocket, watching the Italian bidder make another frantic phone call. I looked up at the stormy landscape on the wall. The dark clouds looked beautiful under the bright gallery lights. "No," I answered, my voice calm and unwavering. "I feel like I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Elias smiled, a genuine expression of profound respect. "The gallery will close in an hour," he said, checking his watch. "Tomorrow morning we move into the main theater. The phone banks will open at 9. The gavel drops at 10. We stood there for a while longer, watching the wealthy elites circle the canvas like sharks sensing a drop of blood in the water. The tension in the rotunda was electric, a heavy, coiled anticipation of the financial battle to come. I finished my sparkling water, set to the empty glass on a passing tray, and took one last look at my grandfather's hidden treasure. The night fell over Miami, painting the skyline in shades of deep violet and gold. The quiet chapter of my journey was officially closed. Tomorrow, the auctioneer would take the podium, the numbers would climb into the stratosphere, and the final, devastating payoff would echo across the world. The calm was over. It was time for the hammer to fall. The main theater of the Miami auction house felt like a modern cathedral dedicated to capital and legacy. I sat behind a thick pane of one-way glass in a private viewing box suspended high above the ground floor. The seats were upholstered in soft charcoal velvet, yielding to the touch. Elias Thorne sat in the chair next to mine, resting a sleek digital tablet on his tailored knee. Below us, the expansive room hummed with a low electric murmur. Men and women who directed global industries sat in orderly rows, holding numbered white paddles. The air inside our soundproofed enclosure smelled faintly of fresh espresso and expensive leather. A silent attendant had placed a tray of delicate pastries and sparkling water on a small table between us. I did not touch the food. My focus was locked on the brightly lit stage down below. The man running the proceedings stepped up to the mahogany rostrum. He wore a flawless tuxedo and commanded the room with a voice like a silver bell. He moved through the early lots with a practiced, rhythmic cadence. A bronze sculpture cast in the 1920s went for $500,000. A collection of rare Impressionist sketches fetched $800,000. I watched the numerical values flash across the giant digital currency board, translating the bids into euros, yen, and pounds in real time. My heart maintained a steady, measured beat. I thought about the broken air conditioning unit in my community center office back in Tampa. I thought about the peeling paint on my apartment door and the rattling engine of my used sedan. The contrast between my daily existence and this theater of extreme wealth was sharp. Yet I did not feel out of place. I felt insulated by the truth. I had not schemed to arrive in this velvet chair. I had simply held my ground. The ambient lights in the main hall dimmed, signaling a shift in the program. A hushed silence fell over the gathered crowd of international collectors. Two handlers wearing pristine white cotton gloves wheeled a reinforced display easel onto the center stage. A heavy velvet drape concealed the item. The gallery spotlights converged on the easel, cutting through the dimness. The handlers pulled the fabric away. The coastal storm landscape seemed to absorb the light, pulling the entire room into its swirling depths. Stripped of decades of dust and set within a meticulously restored wooden frame, the artwork commanded total authority. The rich charcoals and deep navy blues held a vibrant, haunting depth. It did not look like a $40 thrift store find. It looked like a museum centerpiece. Lot 47, the man at the rostrum announced, his voice echoing clearly through our overhead speakers. The lost masterpiece of Henrik Voss, a pivotal work of mid-century modernism preserved in pristine condition. We shall open the bidding at $2 million. Instantly, a white paddle went up in the third row. $2 million is bid, the orchestrator noted, pointing a sleek pen toward the buyer. At the long bank of telephones lining the left wall, an auction house representative raised a hand. $2.5 million from the phone desk, $3 million from the center aisle, 3.5, $4 million. The figures climbed with dizzying speed. There was no hesitation from the floor. The wealthy collectors had waited 30 years for this specific piece to surface from the ashes of history, and they were armed with bottomless resources. I watched a silver-haired man in a linen suit give a subtle nod. I watched a proxy bidder whisper frantically into a headset. The room was a battlefield fought with raised fingers and steady gazes. As the digital board crossed the $5 million threshold, my thoughts drifted north, up the Florida highway. I knew exactly what my relatives were doing at this very second. The auction house provided a global live stream link for their high-profile events, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Savannah was likely sitting on a sagging mattress in her extended stay motel. The neon sign from the highway probably cast a harsh, flickering light through her cheap blinds. She was staring at her cracked smartphone screen, watching the fortune she threw away multiply before her eyes. Patricia was probably pacing the narrow floor of her leased apartment, weeping bitter tears of envy. Surrounded by the remaining vintage mirrors and antique rugs she had scavenged from Grandpa Theo's house, she was witnessing her ultimate social defeat, broadcast live across the world. Uncle Richard was locked in a cold county holding cell. Perhaps he caught a glimpse of the broadcast on a communal television screen down the cell block. He was watching the very canvas he tried to steal, the canvas he orchestrated a fake appraisal for, selling for enough money to buy his entire fraudulent firm twice over. He had risked his freedom for a $10 decoy print, while the real treasure sat here under halogen lights. They were drowning in the wreckage of their own entitlement, while I sat in a secure VIP box, watching the storm they created rain down on them. 5.5 million, the orchestrator called, pointing to the phone bank again. Do I hear 6? A woman in the front row adjusted her designer glasses and gave a crisp nod. 6 million is bid in the room. The rapid-fire calls finally began to slow. The air on the main floor grew thick with tension. The remaining bidders were hitting the ceiling of their authorized limits. 6.2 from the phone bank, the orchestrator declared, his gaze sweeping the silent room. $6,200,000. Are there any further advances? He paused, letting the staggering figure settle over the theater. The silence stretched tight as a wire. Fair warning, he said, his tone signaling the end of the war. He raised his right hand, holding a sculpted wooden gavel. He brought it down against the sounding block. The sharp wooden crack echoed through the audio speakers piping into our private booth. That single, sharp sound hit my ears and instantly transported me back 6 months. It sounded exactly like the authoritative knock Elias Thorne had delivered to my apartment door. The knock that fractured my old reality and built this new one. Sold for $6,200,000 to the anonymous buyer on the telephone. The main floor erupted into polite but enthusiastic applause. The tension broke, washing over the room in a wave of relieved chatter. Elias turned to me and exhaled a long breath, a genuine smile breaking across his composed face. He offered his hand. I shook it, feeling the firm grip of a man who had helped me navigate a perilous minefield. I did not cheer. I did not cry. I did not jump out of my plush seat. I reached into my small leather purse and let my fingertips brush against a tiny object hidden in the side pocket. It was a Polaroid replica photo of the painting I had printed at a local pharmacy months ago. I traced the dark printed clouds with my thumb. The financial victory was monumental, but the emotional vindication was the true prize. I had weathered the storm. The long years of being the designated punchline were over. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy dress. I was ready to walk out of that velvet-lined box and step into a life that was entirely my own. 1 year is enough time for the Earth to rotate the sun, but it is also enough time to build an entirely new life. I am sitting on a wooden deck overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. The salty morning breeze rustles the broad leaves of a palmetto tree in my front yard. I do not live in a sprawling estate gated off from the rest of the world. I did not buy a fleet of exotic sports cars or charter private jets to distant islands. I bought a single-story bungalow with weathered cedar shingles and a wide wraparound porch. It is quiet. The only sound is the rhythmic crash of the ocean waves against the shoreline. When the gavel fell in Miami and the funds cleared into my bank accounts, the sudden wealth felt heavy. It is a strange burden to hold more capital than you could ever spend in a single lifetime. But Grandpa Theo did not endure decades of family greed just to turn me into another version of Uncle Richard. He left me the canvas because he knew I would plant the seeds rather than burn the forest. I kept my job at the youth center in Tampa. However, I no longer spend my afternoons begging local businesses for $50 donations just to keep the lights on. I endowed a permanent trust for the facility. We bought the adjacent empty lot and built a state-of-the-art creative wing. The rooms are filled with drafting tables, fresh clay throwing wheels, and endless rows of vibrant paints. Above the main entrance, polished steel letters spell out the Theodore Mark Foundation. I walk through those halls every week, watching teenagers who previously had nowhere to go, finding their voices through brushstrokes and canvas. The real color is no longer hiding in the dark clouds. It is splashed brightly across the walls of my community. News from my family occasionally drifts down to the coast like debris washing ashore after a hurricane. I do not seek out the updates, but the Tampa grapevine is remarkably efficient. Uncle Richard is currently serving a 72-month sentence in a federal correctional facility near Pensacola. The state auditors unspooled his entire web of forged ledgers and phantom shell companies. He traded his custom-tailored silk suits for a stiff, county-issued uniform. I imagine him sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of his country club memberships and his expensive cigars, having to follow orders from men he would have once refused to look in the eye. Savannah did not land on her feet. The luxury real estate market relies on pristine reputations, and hers was permanently stained by the public foreclosure of the Ocala Lake House and the exposure of our legal battle. She works in a crowded strip mall outside Orlando, now pitching low-tier timeshare packages to weary tourists. She spends her days standing under the brutal Florida sun, handing out glossy brochures for budget resorts, trying to convince strangers to buy into an illusion she can no longer afford herself. Patricia resides in a cramped one-bedroom rental near the highway. The local society pages stopped returning her calls the day Richard was indicted. Her country club friends ghosted her. She spends her time polishing the vintage mirrors she scavenged from Theo's house, surrounded by heavy antique rugs that do not fit in her tiny living room. She is the queen of a very small, lonely kingdom. I feel no lingering bitterness when I hear these updates. There is no urge to gloat. The truth is, I rarely think about them at all. The profound peace I feel sitting on my cedar deck stems from the realization that the high auction price was merely a byproduct of the true inheritance. The real inheritance was the unmasking of the people who held me down. The money was just a key that unlocked the door, allowing me to walk away. Tio gave me the freedom to draw my own boundaries and enforce them with unshakable certainty. I finish my morning coffee and step back inside my coastal home. The interior is bright and airy, smelling of fresh sea salt and citrus. The walls are painted a crisp, warm white. My furniture is comfortable and practical. I walk into the living room holding a brown paper package under my arm. I set it down on the coffee table and tear away the wrapping. It is the cheap, faded print of a stormy beach. The $10 decoy I bought from a Fowler Avenue charity shop to trick Richard and Savannah. I pick up a small hammer and a single metal nail. I find the perfect spot in the center of the living room wall above the fireplace mantel. I tap the nail into the drywall and hang the dark wooden frame. I step back, placing my hands on my hips to ensure it is level. The print is mass-produced cardboard. The frame is chipped. An art appraiser like Elias Thorne would not spare it a second glance. But I am not hanging it because it holds monetary value. I am hanging it because I genuinely like the colors. The deep blues and grays remind me that storms eventually pass, leaving the sky clear and the air clean. It is a monument to the moment I stopped shrinking and started fighting. I walk over to the open window and let the ocean breeze wash over my face. The world is vast and quiet and mine. I share this story not to boast about a sudden fortune, but to offer a simple reminder. People will always try to dictate your value based on their own limitations. They will hand you the scraps and expect you to be grateful. They will mock your quiet endurance because they mistake patience for weakness. But true value rarely announces itself with loud boasting or flashy displays. The most precious things are often hidden, waiting for someone with the patience to look closer. So I will leave you with this final thought. If your family handed you a dusty frame and a lifetime of disrespect, would you look close enough to see the masterpiece?